New York, the early 1970s. The city the world knew as the center of the universe, the beacon of the American dream, was coming apart at the seams. A perfect storm of fiscal crisis, industrial decline, and a social tension that simmered beneath. The asphalt was pushing it to the brink. The Big Apple was rotten from the inside, and the stench of decay was spreading. The federal government, in an act of historic indifference, turned its back. Fear became the new neighbor, a permanent tenant in the mind of every citizen. While the elite of Manhattan, in their apartments overlooking Central Park, wondered if the city would survive just a few miles north, an entire neighborhood had already been living with that question. Not for months, but for decades. This is Harlem, a name that echoes with the weight and glory of Black American history. The epicenter of a cultural renaissance that, 50 years earlier, had redefined art, music, and literature for the world. The spiritual home of giants like Langston Hughes, Duke Ellington, Zora Neale Hurston, and James Baldwin. A place whose very identity was synonymous with pride and creativity. But in 1970, to the rest of a terrified New York, Harlem was seen as the epicenter of another phenomenon, urban collapse. Patient zero for the disease they feared would spread throughout the entire city. The white flight of previous decades had morphed into a mass exodus of the middle class, including many prosperous Black families who sought safety and better schools far from the rising crime and lack of opportunity. What was left behind was a low-income community, battling systemic abandonment on an almost unimaginable scale. The city government, drowning in debt and on the verge of bankruptcy, did the unthinkable. It cut the essentials. Garbage collection became sporadic, creating mountains of debris that were as much a health hazard as a visual symbol of neglect. The schools, already suffering from overcrowding, lost teachers and extracurricular programs, becoming warehouses for children rather than centers of learning. The police, also reduced in number and morale, were seen by many residents not as a protective force, but as an occupying one, indifferent to everyday crime and present only to suppress. Harlem was being actively dismantled, left to die in plain sight. It is at this exact moment of desperation and defiance that our story gains a new pair of eyes, foreign eyes. In Paris, thousands of miles away, the editors of the famous magazine Paris Match wanted a story that would capture the American drama in its rawest form. They wanted to show their European readers the decay of the world's greatest city, a cautionary tale about the end of the American empire. And for this task, they sent one of their best and most sensitive photographers, Jack Garofalo. His mission, dictated from Paris, was clear and somewhat macabre: to document the death of a neighborhood, to find the misery, the despair, the ruin. He came to photograph a funeral, but what his lens found was a baptism. He discovered that even when the structures of a city crumble, when the concrete cracks and the steel rusts, the soul of its people can build something much stronger, much more enduring. He came looking for an end, but what he found and what he would show us was a stubborn and glorious beginning. The streets. For most New Yorkers at the time, a place of transit, a risk to be calculated, a space to be crossed as quickly as possible. But for the residents of the Harlem that Garofalo found, the street was an extension of their homes. It was the living room. It was the backyard. It was the stage where the drama and comedy of life unfolded daily, where the city and its newspapers saw a broken fire hydrant as another sign of vandalism and wasted resources. Garofalo saw an improvised community pool, a source of pure, unforgettable joy under the scorching summer sun. The dominant sound was not of sirens, but of children's laughter, a universal sound that defied any narrative of despair. He began to understand a fundamental truth about Harlem. Life wasn't happening behind closed doors, hidden from the chaos. It was right there, open, vibrant, for anyone who cared to see. Community wasn't a sociological abstraction. It was visible, palpable, audible. It was the elderly neighbor sitting by the window, watching over the children playing on the sidewalk. It was the music that spilled from open windows and became the collective soundtrack of the street, a mix of James Brown, Aretha Franklin, and The Temptations. Garofalo wasn't just taking pictures of a place. He was being invited in to witness resilience in its rawest, most honest, and beautiful form. And then, there is this image, a king in his metal castle. This is not a man defeated by his environment. On the contrary, he dominates it with a quiet, powerful presence. The car, a hot pink Cadillac, is not just a means of transport. It is a throne on wheels. It is a blank canvas that he has painted with the colors of his own identity, an affront to the gray monotony of the urban decay around him. In a society that in countless ways constantly told him he was less than, every detail here screams, "I am more." The impeccable suit, the wide-brimmed hat tilted at the perfect angle, the relaxed yet controlled pose. It is a performance of self-affirmation, a walking work of art. Historians and sociologists call this the aesthetics of opposition. When the traditional channels of power, status, and wealth are systematically denied to a group of people, culture, fashion, and style become vital arenas for competition, expression, and resistance. The body and its adornments are transformed into a text, a political statement. Jack Garofalo, perhaps without knowing the academic terminology, captured the practice perfectly. He saw that dignity was not something these people asked for or expected to be given. It was something they manufactured, that they wore, that they embodied every day they stepped out the door. His camera then turns to the faces. And here, Garofalo transcends photojournalism and becomes a portraitist of souls. He shows us the face of an elderly woman, sitting on a park bench. Her wrinkles are not signs of weariness, but maps of a lifetime of struggles, laughter, and love. In her gentle smile, we see a wisdom that has survived everything. Next, the gaze of a young teenager, leaning against a brick wall. His eyes are challenging, almost confrontational, but beneath that layer of hardness there is a vulnerability, a silent question about the future. He is the product of his environment, but also the promise of its transformation. Garofalo introduces us to an unforgettable gallery of characters. The butcher, with his blood-stained apron, but with immense pride in his craft. The women returning from church on Sundays, in their elaborate hats that are works of art in themselves, an explosion of color and faith. The owner of the barbershop, the unofficial social center of the neighborhood where news was exchanged, debates were heated, and the community was strengthened with every haircut. Each portrait is a refutation of the idea that Harlem was a monolithic place of suffering. It was an ecosystem of individuals, each with their own story, their own dignity, their own shine. He shows us that even amidst material poverty, there was an immense wealth of spirit. The way people carried themselves, the attention to detail, in their clothes even if worn, a colorful handkerchief in a pocket, a shoe shined to a gleam, a long-handled afro pick stuck in the hair like a crown. These were small acts of beauty, small acts of war against the ugliness that surrounded them. Garofalo understood that these were not frivolities. They were tools of psychological survival. They were proof that even when the outside world tries to define you by your lack, you can respond by defining yourself by your abundance of style. This attention to fashion was more than vanity. It was a visual language. It was a non-verbal form of communication that established identity, status, and affiliation within the community. It was the culture of cool, a grace under pressure that would become one of America's greatest cultural exports. Garofalo, with his outsider's perspective, was able to see this not as something exotic, but as a fundamental expression of the human condition, the desire to be seen, to be recognized, to be remembered. His street fashion photos are not a runway show. They are a document on the construction of identity in the face of adversity. And this vibrant energy, this need for expression, demanded a soundtrack, and it was being born, bubbling just beneath the surface. While Garofalo was capturing these scenes of life on the streets of Harlem, just a few miles away, in the equally neglected boroughs of the Bronx, something entirely new and revolutionary was being created from two turntables, a microphone, and the sheer ingenuity of youth. Hip-hop, the poetry of the street, the voice of the forgotten. an art form born directly from the conditions of abandonment that Garofalo was documenting. His photos don't show the first DJs like Kool Herc or Grandmaster Flash in action. They don't capture the first block parties that gave birth to it all. But they are perhaps the most important visual prologue ever recorded. They capture the spirit of hip-hop before it even had a name. The attitude, the posture, the importance of reputation and style, the transformation of public space into a stage for self-expression, the raw energy of young people who had nothing, and therefore decided to create everything. To look at the youth in Garofalo's portraits is to see the fathers and mothers of a culture that was about to conquer the world. Creativity wasn't just in the music and the fashion, it was literally written on the walls. Garofalo's photos begin to record the first traces of what would become the graffiti movement. Names and tags spray-painted on the subway cars that ran through Harlem, on the walls of abandoned buildings. To the city, it was vandalism, another symptom of disorder. But to the youth, it was a way of reclaiming space, of leaving their mark, of screaming, "I exist in a world that preferred them to be invisible." It was art born from concrete, a calligraphy of resistance. And this resistance also took more organized forms. While the city government abandoned them, the residents themselves began to organize. Garofalo documents the determination on the faces of community activists, ordinary people who became leaders, organizing rent strikes against negligent landlords, creating neighborhood patrols to increase safety, transforming trash-filled vacant lots into community gardens. They fought for their buildings, for their rights, for their dignity. Garofalo did not just photograph passive people in a landscape of decay. He photographed active citizens, agents of their own destiny, fighting to save their community from the inside out. And today? What happened to Jack Garofalo's Harlem? A trip through the neighborhood today reveals a stunning transformation. The streets are cleaner. The brownstone buildings have been meticulously restored, their property values soaring into the millions. Major chain stores and sophisticated cafes occupy corners where once there were only local shops. Gentrification, a process that was already taking its first steps in the 70s, has swept through the neighborhood with overwhelming force. Harlem has changed, but at what cost? Jack Garofalo's photos, which were stored away and largely forgotten for nearly 4 decades, re-emerged in the 21st century like a time capsule, a ghost from the past that haunts the present. They are more than a historical record. They are a reminder of the strength, the joy, and the indomitable soul of a community that refused to be erased from history. They force us to ask, what was gained and what was lost? Safety has improved, but at what price for the original community, many of whom can no longer afford to live in their grandparents' neighborhood? They teach us that even in the darkest of times, humanity finds a way to shine, to create beauty, to assert its existence. The true soul of a place is not in its brick-and-mortar buildings, but in the stories, the struggles, and the hearts of its people. Garofalo's photos are proof that the official history rarely tells the whole story. The truth, real life, is most often in the details, in a smile, in a gesture, in a pair of colorful shoes. Stories like that of Harlem in 1970 are everywhere, hidden beneath the surface of what we are told, waiting to be discovered. They are proof that reality is always more complex, more contradictory, and infinitely more fascinating than any newspaper headline. If you also believe that it's worth searching for these truths, that you have to unearth the past to understand the complexities of the present, then your place is here. Subscribe, because we don't just tell stories, we hunt for their souls.